50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles, right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell the story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. They had everything they needed: a name, a symbol, a manifesto that laid out exactly who the enemy was and why the enemy had to be destroyed, a structure, a hierarchy, a set of new identities that had replaced the ones their members had been born with, weapons in the closet, and a combat veteran running drills, and two ferociously committed political writers producing communiques that crackled with urgency and rage. What they did not have was an action. Without an action, everything else was theater. The manifesto was a declaration of war not yet followed by a single shot. The Revolutionary Army was a handful of people in an Oakland apartment, clipping newspapers, arguing about targets, postponing decisions, watching the world continue without noticing them. The gap between who they believed they were and what they had actually done was, by the fall of 1973, becoming impossible to ignore. This episode is about how that gap gets closed, about the process by which people who have committed everything to a cause try to decide what that cause requires in practice rather than theory, about the arguments and postponements and targets proposed and rejected, and the exact moment when the ideology stopped being abstract and became operational. It is also about a man who had nothing to do with any of this, who did not know these people existed, who was doing the hardest and most necessary work available to anyone trying to improve the conditions of Black life in Oakland, with patience, skill, and a 20-year record of results. Inside the institutions the SLA had declared war on, building the coalitions and programs and infrastructure that the SLA's theory said were impossible. The SLA's theory had a category for people who did what this man was doing. It called them collaborators, agents, fascist insects preying upon the life of the people. What happens when a closed ideological system is handed a man whose entire life contradicts its premises, a man whose record is evidence that the closed room is wrong? That's the central question of this episode. The answer is one of the most morally devastating moments in this entire series. The organization that would, within months, carry out one of the most sensational crimes in American history, the act that would put their name on the front page of every newspaper in the country for the better part of 2 years, was, in October of 1973, a group of people in an apartment clipping newspapers. They were meticulous about it. Sinq, Zoya, and Fahiza followed the news with the focused attention of people who believed history was happening around them and that their role in it was imminent. Zoya used her access to the Berkeley Public Library to feed the operation with research material, documents, articles, backgrounds on targets, the intellectual ammunition that would become the SLA's communiques. They filed everything by name and subject, building an indexed archive of the world they were preparing to fight. Kujou had moved out of Peking House into an apartment with Bo. Jelena, who was sleeping with Bo, also stayed there. Faiza kept lists. Her to-do compilations were a window into the surreal constellation of priorities inside that apartment. The communique, all these papers, the filing cabinet memorized, addresses, make Molotov cocktails, woodcutting, buy bolts of material. Revolutionary administration looked from the inside a great deal like any other kind. The same accumulation of tasks, the same gap between the urgency of the vision and the mundanity of the execution. They were saving Senkyu's empty plum wine bottles to use as Molotov cocktails. The revolution was being built from recycled materials while the world outside continued without noticing. The question that occupied the apartment on East 17th Street through the fall of 1973 was one that every revolutionary organization eventually has to answer. What do we do first? The manifesto had declared war. The declaration required action. But action against what? Against whom? The SLA had a theory of history that told them a small committed vanguard could spark a mass uprising, but the theory required a first move, and that move had to be right. It had to announce them. It had to prove their seriousness. It had to demonstrate to the radical left that had ignored them and the communities they claimed to represent that the Symbionese Liberation Army was not another Bay Area radical group that talked about revolution without meaning it. They meant it. The question was how to prove it. Put yourself in that room. Senkyu at the center, presiding, Zoya beside him, the most intellectually serious person in the room, and the one most likely to find a flaw in an argument before it became a mistake. Faiza at the table, writing, always writing, the urgency in her hand matching the urgency in the room. Kujou, Willie Wolf, still the warmest presence, the conscience of the group made human. Osceola, thinking, rigorous as ever, the engineering student's mind applied to the problem of revolutionary action. Bo, Ramiro, the only one who had actually killed people, who understood in his body rather than his mind what armed action required and what it cost. And Thera Wheeler, still in orbit, still skeptical enough to say out loud what the others were beginning to think privately. The first proposed target was an Avis rental car office. Faiza had already drafted the communique. Avis supported the fascist governments of Portugal, Israel, and others, making it a legitimate target of revolutionary war. The logic was, within the closed system of the SLA's ideology, coherent. Osceola thought about it systematically. An Avis office. What would that accomplish? Who would notice? A bombed car rental office was a property crime. It was not a declaration of war. It was not the action that would force the country to confront the diagnosis the manifesto had made. It was the kind of thing that got 3 lines in the newspaper and was forgotten by morning. The second proposed target was Raymond Pecunier, the director of the California prison system. Pecunier was a genuine symbol of the institution the SLA had built its entire ideology around opposing. The prison system as racial capitalism made concrete. An action against Pecunier would connect directly to the argument the manifesto was making. It would be a political act rather than a property crime. The planning went further with Pecunier than it had with Avis, further and then postponed. The frustration in that room was real and building. The organization had committed everything, given up names and families and futures, had declared war on the fascist American state. And the fascist American state had not noticed. The radical left had not rallied. The Black community had not risen. The mass uprising the vanguard theory promised had not materialized because the exemplary action had not happened. The theory was waiting on the practice, and the practice kept getting postponed. Senkyu was not comfortable with doubt. Emily Harris later noted that he tolerated absolutely no criticism of himself, of the organization, of the ideology. But doubt was accumulating in the form of an organization that had declared war and was unable to fight it. He needed an action. He needed it to be significant. He needed it now. It was in this atmosphere that Theo Wheeler, one evening in October, began talking about Marcus Foster. Wheeler had the credibility that Syngku lacked, the genuine revolutionary credentials, the ideological seriousness, the connections to the broader movement. When Wheeler spoke, people listened in a way they did not always listen to Syngku. And what Wheeler was saying was that there was a target hiding in plain sight, a man doing the work of the fascist state from inside the Black community, a man whose proposals, bringing police into Oakland schools, requiring students to carry identification cards, amounted in Wheeler's reading to a fascist plot against Black youth, the surveillance state extending into the bodies of children, the prison system reaching into the schools. The name he gave them was Marcus Foster. Marcus Foster was the superintendent of the Oakland Unified School District, the city's first Black school administrator, a man who had spent his professional life in the service of the most underserved children in Oakland and Philadelphia before that. A figure the Black community, the community the SLA claimed to be fighting for, regarded with genuine admiration and affection. The SLA's ideology had a category for this: the collaborator, the Black man co-opted by the system, the agent of fascism operating under the cover of community service, the enemy most dangerous precisely because he appeared to be a friend. The identification cards were the key. In the SLA's framework, they were not an administrative proposal. They were the first step toward a domestic passport system, fascism with a black face, which made it more insidious than fascism with a white one. The room absorbed this argument in the closed system of the SLA's ideology. It was coherent. It answered every objection in advance. Anyone who disagreed was either naive or complicit. The argument landed. Syngku pressed ahead. The target had been named. Wheeler and Seam left the apartment shortly after, driven out not by disagreement, but by something uglier that we will return to. But the name Marcus Foster remained in the room after they left. It remained there until the night of November 6, 1973. Before we get to that night, before we follow the SLA to the moment that would define everything that followed, we need to spend some time with Marcus Foster himself. Not with his death, with his life. Marcus Foster was born on March 31st, 1923 in Athens, Georgia, the youngest of 5 children raised by a determined single mother. She named her youngest son after a Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, who had written that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. Whether she intended the full weight of that name or simply liked the sound of it, she gave her son something to grow into. The family made their way to Philadelphia, as hundreds of thousands of Black Southern families made their way to northern cities in the first decades of the 20th century, not to paradise, but to possibility. Philadelphia in the 1920s and 1930s was segregated in ways less formal than the Jim Crow South, but no less real. A city where Black families were confined to specific neighborhoods, specific schools, specific futures by the machinery of northern racism that liked to congratulate itself on being more civilized than Georgia while producing the same outcomes. Marcus Foster grew up in those neighborhoods. By his own account, that the trajectory of his early life did not obviously distinguish him from the boys around him who would end up in trouble. He drank wine as a boy. He fought more than he read. He ran with peers whose futures had already been written in the language of the same prison system that 40 years later, an organization claiming to fight for people like them would use to justify his murder. What changed the trajectory was his mother's example and his own stubborn conviction that education was the engine of transformation. Not education as credential, not education as the mechanism by which exceptional individuals escaped their circumstances and left everyone else behind. Education as community transformation, the unglamorous work of building institutions capable of changing the conditions of an entire neighborhood rather than the prospects of a fortunate few. That conviction would take him 50 years to fully express. It would cost him his life before he saw it completed. He graduated near the top of his high school class and went on to Cheney State College, the historically Black institution outside Philadelphia that was, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, one of the few places of higher education that would welcome a poor African-American young man from the Philadelphia ghetto. He graduated near the top of his class there, too, in 1947, and entered the Philadelphia public school system as a teacher. What followed was 2 decades of work that most accounts compress into a biographical footnote on the way to the story that ended his life. This is a mistake. The 2 decades in Philadelphia are not prelude, they are the point. They are what the SLA never bothered to examine when they added his name to their enemy list, because examining them would have required contact with reality, and the closed room did not do that. He became a principal, not at a flagship school in a stable neighborhood. He took on the schools that nobody else wanted, the troubled schools, the worst reputations, the highest rates of failure, the students already written off by the system. He transformed them, not through charisma alone, though he had extraordinary charisma, not through discipline, though he believed in it, through the patient, relationship-based work of convincing students, parents, teachers, and community members that they were not what the system said they were. He led his schools into a Ford Foundation pilot project in compensatory education, work that would help shape national education and anti-poverty policy during the 1960s. He developed programs that raised academic expectations in schools where no one had previously expected very much. He figured out through years of practice rather than theory that the transformation of a school required the transformation of the community around it, that parents had to be partners, that the neighborhood had to be invested, that education could not stop at the school building's door. There is a story from his Philadelphia years that tells you more about Marcus Foster than any summary of his accomplishments can. At a high-level meeting of school officials called to address gang violence in Philadelphia schools, the door burst open. 10 young Black men entered the room firing guns. The officials dove under the tables. Some fled. Marcus Foster stood up and told everyone to calm down. The guns were firing blanks. Foster had arranged the demonstration himself, recruiting the young men specifically for this purpose. He let the silence settle over the room full of shaken administrators and then told them what he wanted them to understand, that this was how it felt to be a child in a Philadelphia school, to not know when or where something like this would happen, to carry that fear every day as background noise, the way middle-class people carry the fear of a flat tire, and to be expected to learn in spite of it. The demonstration was outrageous. It was also, by every account of the people in that room, unforgettable. This was how Marcus Foster worked, not with position papers and administrative memos, though he wrote those too, with the embodied, you cannot look away insistence that the people making decisions about children's lives understand what those children's lives actually felt like. He was an unusual man. By the time he left the city of brotherly love, Marcus Foster had received the Philadelphia Award, the city's highest civic honor. He built a record that was, by any honest measure, one of the most impressive in American public education. He had done it not in the easy schools, but in the hardest ones, not with the advantaged students, but with the ones the system had already given up on, consistently refusing to accept that the constraints were permanent. He had earned the genuine affection of the Black community in Philadelphia, the respect that comes not from symbolism or celebrity, but from showing up year after year in the places where the work was hardest, in ways that people could see and feel in their own children's lives. In 1970, he went west and was named superintendent of the Oakland Unified School District, the first Black school superintendent in the city's history. Oakland was not Philadelphia. The Black Power movement had deep roots there. The Panthers had been founded in Oakland. The radicalism of the Bay Area left was a constant presence. Foster arrived in the city watching him carefully, with high expectations and a sophisticated political culture that would not extend automatic deference to a Black administrator any more than it had to white ones. He did not ask for deference. He asked for partnership. He brought to Oakland the same philosophy developed over 20 years in Philadelphia, that the community was not the audience for educational transformation, but its engine, that parents and students and neighborhood organizations were not problems to be managed, but resources to be mobilized, that the superintendent's work was not to administer from above, but to organize from within. He had been in Oakland for 3 years when the SLA added his name to their enemy list. 3 years in which he had built coalitions, reformed programs, and navigated the impossible politics of a city school system caught between a conservative establishment and a radical left that both claimed to speak for the Black community, and neither of which had the patience for the slow, unglamorous work that genuine transformation required. 3 years in which he had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that Black Oakland actually needed. The SLA declared war on the fascist insect that preyed upon the life of the people. They had just decided that Marcus Foster was that insect. When Marcus Foster stepped to the podium at the Oakland Civic Auditorium in 1970 to address the teachers, parents, and community members who had come to see what kind of man had just taken over their schools, he said something that the people in that room did not forget. Oakland's time was now, he told them, their time, their season, their opportunity to write something new. It was a remarkable thing to say about a school system that was, by any honest assessment, in serious trouble. The Oakland Unified School District in 1970 was underfunded, politically fractured, and caught in the crossfire of a city that could not agree on what its schools were for or who they were supposed to serve. It was the kind of job that ambitious administrators avoided and cautious ones survived by doing as little as possible and offending nobody. It was the kind of job you took if you believed, against the available evidence, that something genuinely different was possible. Marcus Foster believed that. He had spent 20 years proving it in Philadelphia. He came to Oakland to prove it again, in harder conditions, at a larger scale, with full knowledge of what he was walking into. The political terrain he was navigating would have defeated a less gifted institutional operator. On one side sat the conservative establishment, the governor's office, the county power structure, the local newspaper, the forces that wanted low taxes and tight discipline, and schools that kept their complications out of the headlines. On the other side sat the Black Power movement, with its deepest California roots in Oakland, its sophisticated organizational infrastructure, and its fundamental skepticism of any Black administrator who had chosen to work within the educational system rather than against it. The Black Panthers had built their base in Oakland. They had opinions about the schools and the organizational capacity to express those opinions loudly. In the middle of these two forces, largely invisible to both, were the children. The violence in Oakland's schools in the early 1970s was not a statistic. It was daily and present in the lives of every student and teacher in the district. In a single year, there had been dozens of assaults on students and staff. A young woman had been stabbed to death by an outsider who walked into Oakland Technical High School. The buildings that were supposed to be the safest places in a child's day were not safe. Foster's response was to build a comprehensive safety initiative, one that brought together the school system, the juvenile courts, probation and parole, and community peace officers in a coordinated approach. The plan included a truancy coordinator. It also included student identification cards, a standard administrative tool that urban school systems across the country used routinely, that had in fact already been approved in Oakland's own budget 2 years earlier without a word of objection from anyone. The plan was reasonable, the plan was necessary, and the plan could not be adequately funded. What Foster was actually doing in Oakland, the institutional transformation happening in real time while the ideological battles raged around it, deserved more attention than it received. He created a principal selection process unlike anything the district had seen. Parents, teachers, and students participated in choosing the people who would lead their schools, because Foster believed that the people closest to the work understood it better than those administering it from a distance. 2/3 of the district's 91 principals were selected through this process. The community was not consulted, the community decided. He launched a civic engagement initiative that brought nearly 2,500 Oakland residents, crossing lines of race, income, and political affiliation that the city's ordinary life kept carefully separated, into collaborative work on educational policy, not as advisory bodies, as actual decision-making participants. The coalition he built included people who had never been in the same room together, who found they could work toward shared goals even when they disagreed about everything else. He had a particular gift that people who worked with him described consistently: the ability to connect people with resources to people with needs. One Oakland principal put it simply: he could bring together people who had money and people who didn't, and what came out was space for teachers and students to build things that had never existed before. 2 months before he died, he established a private educational foundation, the first local education fund of its kind in the United States. The model now exists in more than 2,500 school districts nationwide. What that foundation funded gives you the clearest picture of what Foster was trying to build. Students at one school designated and constructed a house in a West Oakland neighborhood, learning architecture, construction, and project management simultaneously. Students at Castlemont High School ran a coffee operation at the Oakland airport, learning business and professional conduct in a real commercial environment. An after-school program became the template for government-funded programs that would eventually serve millions of American children. These were not remedial programs. They were not charitable interventions of a system that had decided what disadvantaged children needed without asking them. They were built on the conviction that children written off by the existing educational order were not deficient but underserved, that given genuine resources and genuine respect, they were capable of things the system had never thought to ask of them. The political pressures on Foster never relented. The school violence gave the conservative establishment a hammer it used consistently, demanding crackdowns and police presence and the kind of zero-tolerance discipline that Foster understood from 20 years of experience produced compliance without transformation. The Black Power movement applied pressure from the other direction, questioning his credentials, testing his commitments, occasionally demanding that he take positions that would have cost him the coalition he was building. He did not respond by choosing sides. He responded by doing the work and letting the work speak. When the Panthers offered to provide school security, he engaged with the offer seriously rather than dismissing it, explained his reasoning, and held his position. When the district's Black Caucus questioned his loyalties, he sat down with them. When his proposals were criticized simultaneously from both directions, he treated that as evidence he was operating in the right place. Oakland renewed his contract in 1973 for 4 additional years. The renewal was celebrated in the city, partly because it was genuinely good news, and partly because everyone understood that other cities were actively trying to recruit him away. He was widely regarded by the people in a position to assess such things as one of the most effective urban school leaders in the country. In the fall of 1973, Marcus Foster had been in Oakland for 3 years. In those 3 years, he had built the first local education foundation in American history, created the most participatory principal selection process in the country, launched a civic engagement initiative that brought thousands of residents into genuine educational decision-making, and funded programs for students that had no precedent anywhere. He was building multiracial coalitions. He was distributing power rather than concentrating it. He was treating the most marginalized children in Oakland as capable human beings with futures worth investing in. He was doing the slow, unglamorous, relationship-based work that actually transforms communities, the work that requires patience and coalition, and the willingness to operate inside imperfect institutions rather than declaring war on them from outside. He was doing exactly what the ideology the SLA had constructed claimed to want done, with a track record, with evidence, with results visible in the lives of children in Oakland schools. The Symbionese Liberation Army looked at this man and put a target on his back. The lie that got Marcus Foster killed was not complicated. It did not require elaborate fabrication or sophisticated disinformation. It required only what the closed room always requires: the willingness to take observable reality and run it through an ideological filter until it produces the conclusion the ideology needs. The filter was already built. The conclusion was already determined. All that remained was the language that would transform a Black educator into a fascist agent in a communique the SLA could read aloud as justification for what they had already decided to do. SYNQ assigned the task to Faiza. She went to the files that Zoya had assembled from the Berkeley Public Library, the clippings from underground publications, the radical press, the ecosystem of Bay Area left media covering the controversy over Foster and the Oakland schools. She constructed from those materials an indictment. The core accusation involved federal funding for school security, reframed as the implementation of a political police force within the schools. It was charged that student identification cards were not an administrative tool, but a mechanism for building surveillance files on Black youth, a bio-dossier system in service of what the communique described as an internal warfare identification program. The language was incoherent. The underlying rage was real. And the gap between the language and the reality, between what the communication charged Marcus Foster with doing and what Marcus Foster was actually doing, is the thing this act is about. That fall, Zoya called a friend and asked them to destroy all photographs of her. Jelena sent a letter to her brother writing that the family should consider her dead. The California Council on Criminal Justice had agreed to provide a substantial grant to the Oakland School District. In the revision of that agreement, a clause appeared stipulating that school security personnel under the program would need to have a law enforcement background. It was the kind of bureaucratic language inserted by administrators not thinking about the political implications at the receiving end. Foster caught it. He was upset. He went to the October 9th school board meeting prepared to address it directly, made clear that he had not requested the change and would not implement it, and went further. He agreed to walk back the student identification card proposal entirely, removing from the table the specific issue that had generated the most community opposition. Marcus Foster, at the October 9th school board meeting, explicitly reversed course on the two issues the SLA would use to justify killing him. Willie Wolfe, Joe, was in that meeting. He was there on behalf of the Symbionese Liberation Army, sent to observe and report back on the controversy over policing in schools. He sat in that room and watched Foster address the community directly and honestly. He heard Foster's unambiguous statement that he would not endorse a police presence in the schools. He witnessed the response of the audience, not a community confronting a fascist takeover, but a community that had raised legitimate concerns and was watching its superintendent take those concerns seriously. What Wolfe brought back is not fully documented. What we know is what did not happen. No one in the SLA raised serious questions about whether the premises of their indictment against Foster were accurate. The communique charging Foster with implementing a police state continued to take shape. The meeting at which Foster had explicitly reversed course was absorbed into the closed room and produced no visible effect. This is the moment that clarifies more sharply than any other how the closed room actually functioned. Wolfe was present at the event that most directly contradicted the case against Marcus Foster, and he was the least confrontational member of the group, the most reluctant to challenge decisions already made, the most likely to argue against violence, however. Whether he argued with Synghu is unknown. What is documented is that the information did not alter the group's trajectory. Around the same time, Wolfe's father came to Oakland to visit. Willie gave no indication that anything unusual was happening. He said nothing about the SLA, nothing about the planning underway, nothing about Marcus Foster. He was, to his father, the same warm and directionless young man who had gone to Berkeley to study archaeology and gotten absorbed into the political scene. Theodore Wheeler had been the one who first brought Marcus Foster's name into the room. He had raised the school controversy in the language of radical critique. The identification cards, the federal security funding, the framing that the Bay Area underground press had been developing for months. He had done it as a subject for discussion, as evidence of the system's reach, as a data point in the ongoing argument about who the enemy was. He had not done it as a proposal for murder. When Synghu made clear that the group was going to move beyond discussion, that Marcus Foster was not going to be the subject of a communique, but of an assassination, Wheeler was horrified. This was not what he had meant. This was not what he had signed up for. He had skepticism about DeFreeze's grandiosity from the beginning, had read the notebook of organizational charts and called it suicide to DeFreeze's face. But skepticism about strategy was different from what he was now confronting. An actual plan to kill an actual person, a Black educator, a man whose relationship to the Black community was not that of an oppressor, but of someone who had devoted his professional life to its children. Mary Alice Seam, who had been funding the organization from her inheritance, arrived at the same conclusion. This had crossed a line she could not follow across. Wheeler and Seam wanted out. They made this known, and what happened next revealed something essential about the organization that the manifesto and the Cobra emblem and the new names had obscured. Synghu pulled out a .357 Magnum and pressed it into Wheeler's stomach. He told Wheeler he was going to kill him. Kill him, kill Seam, kill the 2-year-old child Seam had from a previous relationship. The threat was specific and the weapon was real. The demand was that Wheeler begin actively recruiting for the organization rather than preparing to leave it. Before Synghu was done, he had also taken several $100s from Seam, money from the trust fund that had been keeping the organization alive, taken at gunpoint from the woman who had previously been giving it voluntarily. Wheeler and Seam walked out of that apartment and did not go back. The organization that had declared war on fascism in the name of all oppressed people had just held a gun to the stomach of a Black man, threatened to murder a woman and her child, and robbed the person financing their revolution. The enemy list was more flexible than the manifesto had suggested. It could accommodate anyone who tried to leave the room. Wheeler fled to Houston under a false identity, trying to arrange the medical treatment for his bleeding ulcer that the California prison system had refused to provide for years. Seam disappeared with her child. The organization's most credible outside voice and its primary source of funding were gone simultaneously, driven out by the man whose revolutionary credentials they had been lending legitimacy to. The planning for the assassination of Marcus Foster continued without them. The portrait of Foster that the SLA was working from bore almost no relationship to the man the Oakland community actually knew. The Bay Area underground publications had processed the school controversy through an ideological lens that converted every administrative decision Foster made into evidence of systemic betrayal. His engagement with federal funding became collaboration with the state. His security initiative became a police apparatus. His willingness to operate within institutional constraints, the precise quality that made him effective, became the most damning thing about him. What this reading could not accommodate was the reality the Oakland community held. Foster was the first Black superintendent in the city's history to earn genuine respect across Oakland's fractured political landscape. Even the Black Panthers, the organization whose rhetoric the SLA drew on most heavily, had a working relationship with Foster that was complicated and adult and real. Elaine Brown had approached Foster about the Panthers providing paid security in the schools, simultaneously a political statement about community control and a practical offer. Foster had declined, thoughtfully, explaining his reasoning without dismissing theirs. It was a conversation between people who disagreed about tactics while sharing fundamental concerns about the same children. This was the actual texture of Marcus Foster's relationship with the radical left in Oakland, not collaboration with the oppressor, not the implementation of a police state, a serious, complicated negotiation between a man trying to build something lasting inside a broken institution and a community that had every historical reason to distrust those institutions, watching carefully to see whether this particular man was different. The SLA had watched through the lens of an ideology that had already decided what they would see. The radical press framing, filtered through Zoya's library research and Fahiza's urgent prose and the closed room's absolute prohibition on doubt, had produced a picture of Marcus Foster that bore no resemblance to the man who had stood before the Oakland community on October 9th and explicitly reversed course on the two policies being used to justify his execution. The man in that picture was a fascist instrument. The man in that meeting was an educator trying to protect children. On November 6, 1973, Marcus Foster appeared before the Oakland City Council in the afternoon to make a case for restoring funding to keep school gymnasium doors open after hours, after-school gym access for children who needed somewhere safe to be after the last bell. From the council chamber, he went back to the district's administration building for an evening school board meeting, the kind of accumulated, necessary, detail-oriented work that filled a superintendent's calendar and that Marcus Foster attended to with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. Just after 7 o'clock in the evening, he and Robert Blackburn gathered their belongings and walked out of the building toward the parking lot. Robert Blackburn was the Oakland School District's deputy superintendent, and he was Marcus Foster's closest friend. They had come up together professionally, had navigated the gauntlet of urban educational politics together, had built the work in Oakland together. Blackburn was white, a former Peace Corps member from a middle-class background whose idealism had found its expression in the same institutional work that Foster believed in. They were, in the irreplaceable way of people who do hard work together over time, indispensable to each other. The evening was cold. The asphalt behind the administration building was wet from recent rain. They walked through the alleyway toward the parking lot, Blackburn with his car keys already in his hand, Foster a few steps behind. Blackburn noticed people waiting in the shadows. He registered it, the presence of figures in a parking lot at night, and quickened his pace toward his car. Faiza fired first. She was positioned in the alleyway with a Walther PP-380 automatic pistol, and she opened the action. Her first shot missed. Her second struck Foster in the leg. He staggered. Cinque stepped forward from the shadows with a 12-gauge Remington shotgun and fired twice toward Blackburn. The pellets tore across Blackburn's back, and he spun with the impact, 23 entry and exit wounds opening across his body in an instant. A leather appointment book in his breast pocket absorbed a part of the force of one blast. He remained on his feet, barely. Zoya moved toward Foster. She walked, not ran, walked, covering the distance between herself and the man who had just been shot and was lunging for the door of Blackburn's car. She was carrying a .38 Special Rossi revolver. She fired as she closed the distance, hitting Foster repeatedly. He fell. He was face down on the wet asphalt of the parking lot, and Zoya stood over him and fired a final shot into the back of his neck, severing his spinal column. Marcus Foster was dead before the ambulance arrived.
A warning to the fascist corporate military state. We have declared revolutionary war upon you, the enemy of the people, and our seriousness and determination will not be swayed by any number of your U.S. government-inspected super pigs. For those that you have hunted are now hunting for the people.
Blackburn made it back inside the building. He stumbled through a door, collapsed to the floor, and called for help. He had been hit across the back and struck a second time at closer range. 23 wounds. The leather appointment book had saved his life in the most literal sense, absorbed enough force that the shot did not reach, but it otherwise would have. Robert Blackburn survived November 6, 1973. His best friend did not. Cinque, Faiza, and Zoya covered 2 blocks on foot to a waiting car. Inside were Bo and Osceola, who drove them away into the Oakland night. The entire action, as the SLA called it, was over in seconds. The police arrived within minutes. They found school officials standing over Marcus Foster's body in the parking lot. They found shell casings on the wet asphalt. They found footprints in the bushes near the alleyway where the shooters had waited. And when investigators examined the spent ammunition recovered from the scene, they found something that stopped them, something in the construction of the bullets that none of them had encountered before, and that would, in the days following, add a dimension to this killing that transformed it from a political assassination into something the country had no ready category for. Foster had been shot 8 times, 5 bullets in the back, 2 in the front, one final shot into the neck that ended his life on wet asphalt behind a building he had walked into that morning as the most respected educator in Oakland. He was 50 years old. He had 4 years remaining on the contract the city had renewed because it could not afford to lose him. He had spent the afternoon arguing for after-school gym access for children who needed somewhere safe to be. Marcus Foster died without knowing why he was targeted, without knowing who fired those guns, without knowing that there was a group of people who had been sitting in an Oakland apartment clipping newspapers and constructing from those clippings and from an ideology that had already decided what it would find a portrait of him as a fascist agent of oppression. He never knew about their communique. He never knew about the seven-headed cobra or the names these people had given themselves. He was not famous in the way that makes you a target of obsession. He was famous in the local, meaningful way of a man who had earned genuine trust in a community through hard work over an extended period of time. He had devoted his life to the children the Symbionese Liberation Army claimed to be fighting for. They shot him 8 times on a wet parking lot and drove away into the night. Senkyu, Zoya, and Faiza rode away from that parking lot, believing they had done something historic, not monstrous, historic. And their framework, the manifesto, the enemy list, the ideology that had answered every question in advance, what had happened on the wet asphalt behind the Oakland Board of Education building on the night of November 6th was not a murder, a revolutionary act, the first salvo in the war they had declared, the proof that the Symbionese Liberation Army was not another Bay Area radical group that talked about revolution without meaning it. They meant it. They had just proved it. Bo drove. Osceola was beside him. The 3 who had been in the alleyway sat in the back. The car moved through Oakland, and the city continued around them, unaware. The ordinary Tuesday night of a place that did not yet know what had just happened in its parking lot. They believed they had won something. In the days that followed, while the organization waited for the world to absorb what they had done, the medical examiner's office in Oakland was doing its work. The body of Marcus Foster told a story that investigators had not expected. He had been struck 8 times. 5 bullets had entered from the back, 2 from the front. A final shot, fired at close range into the back of his neck, had severed his spinal column. The shooting had been methodical, not the chaos of an ambush gone wrong, but the deliberate execution of a plan prepared in advance and carried out with discipline. And then the forensic examination found something that stopped the room. The tips of the bullets had been drilled. Not damaged, not deformed by impact, drilled cleanly, precisely, with a tool and an intention. The examiner examined the cavity and found what had been placed inside it: potassium cyanide. In each bullet recovered from Marcus Foster's body, the tip had been hollowed out and packed with poison. The modification served one purpose: to ensure that no wound, however survivable on its own terms, would allow the target to live. If the bullet did not kill, the cyanide would. There was no scenario, no lucky angle, no missed vital organ, no emergency room intervention in which Marcus Foster was meant to leave that parking lot alive. The people who prepared those bullets had thought it through and eliminated every possibility of survival they could reach. The medical examiner's report laid it out in flat, precise forensic language. Drilled tips, potassium cyanide, 8 wounds, spinal column severed by the final shot. No one in Oakland or in California or in the country had seen anything like it. In the apartment, Senkyu and the others were certain they had prepared those bullets themselves. The drilling, the filling, the careful modification of each round with the focused attention of people who understood exactly what they were doing and had no reservation about doing it. They had prepared a communique. Faiza had written it with her characteristic urgency: the indictment of Foster as a fascist agent, the declaration that the SLA had carried out a revolutionary execution, the signature line about the venom of the 7 heads destroying the fascist insect. They believed the declaration would land like a thunderclap. They believed the radical left would recognize what they had done as the opening of the war the manifesto had declared. They believed the action would announce them, validate them, force a reckoning with the diagnosis they had been building toward for months. They had no doubt. The cyanide in those bullets was not an afterthought. It was a commitment rendered in chemistry. the material expression of an organization that had decided completely, without reservation, that what it was doing was not only justified but necessary. You do not drill the tips of bullets and fill them with poison if you are uncertain. You do not take that kind of care over the death of a human being unless you have arrived through whatever path brought you there at absolute certainty. They were certain. St-Q had declared war on the fascist insect that preyed upon the life of the people. Zoya had built the intellectual architecture that made the declaration coherent. Fahiza had put it into language that crackled with conviction. Bo had trained them. Osceola had thought it through. Kajo had connected the pieces. Jelena had embodied the cause. They had fired the first shot of their revolution on a Tuesday night in November in a parking lot in Oakland with cyanide in the bullets because they wanted to be sure, because they were sure, because the closed room had made them sure in a way that nothing outside it could touch. Marcus Foster was dead. The Symbionese Liberation Army was ready for what came next. They had absolutely no idea what that was going to be. Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence, and violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. On the next episode of House on Fire, the Symbionese Liberation Army has killed Marcus Foster. They are waiting behind drawn curtains in a house in Concord, certain that what they have done will change everything. They are about to find out how right they are, just not in the way they expected. What follows will set off a chain of events that none of them anticipated, and none of them will be able to stop. Condemnation, exposure, arrests, a failed attempt to burn the evidence, and an organization scrambling to find the action that will salvage everything. They are making lists. They are reading the newspapers. And somewhere on those lists is a name that will make the Symbionese Liberation Army famous in a way that Marcus Foster's murder never could. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time. Additional audio recordings by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army.